Hey yo, how's everybody doing? Whew, I really kind of wasn't sure I was going to even do a live stream today, but I decided to do it. So here I am. Um, AJ3, how are you doing, sir? Hope you had a good weekend. Hope everybody had a strong weekend. Um, he's got a lot going on, man. I really don't have much to talk about, really. Um, I know since the last time we spoke, there has been some lawsuits that have been dropped on UMG by Drake. I guess I don't know a lot about that. I guess I'm gonna just do uh, a quick thing about it, and maybe not talk any real detail about it, because I don't know. Haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, um, and to me, it's kind of it's kind of stupid to file a lawsuit in this way. But you have to ask the question. I mean, what else could the guy do? Um, there was also a lot of allegations towards former author Neil Gaiman, um, who wrote such quote unquote legendary works as Anansi Boys and American Gods. A lot of course, he was also the architect of the Sandman series from Vertigo. There's a lot of stuff about him out there as well. Um, that stuff's horrible, really horrible stuff. I guess we could talk about that a little bit. Um, and his cancellation, which has been swift and quite violent. Not physically violent, but um, has been pretty well. It's been ongoing because they've been trying to cancel Neil Gaiman for a while, but they finally got to him. His comic books and stuff were being canceled left and right. A lot of TV shows and stuff about Neil Gaiman is being canceled. Um, AJ3 was touched on something I want to talk about. A lot of the black conservatives are in an interesting position right now because there's a lot of negativity about Martin Luther King that's coming out. Uh, and they're in an interesting situation. Um, now, let's start right there. Let's start with the Martin Luther King stuff. There is material out right now about Martin Luther King. The material that's out right now is stuff that has been out for a while. They haven't really gone after and gone. I mean, it's only been a couple of days since they declassified the King material. It's only been a couple of days since they declassified this stuff, and they followed King for years and years. There's no way that material is out yet. What they got is about 23 pages of material that's out there about Martin Luther King, and none of it's flattering. And I've seen it has caused quite a stir, I guess you could say. Um, just the stuff that's out right now has caused quite a stir due to some of the sexual depravity that he has been accused of. Over the years, a lot of conservatives have taken aim at Martin Luther King for various different reasons. One of those reasons is because he reportedly was a plagiarist and didn't write a lot of his own paperwork, write his own books. Um, some of it has been his questioning of Christianity or some of the things that he wrote about Christianity. Um, and for me, that's kind of where it begins. Because there's two things that I don't think can really be denied, and that is I'm not sure what kind of Christian pastor Martin Luther King was, and I'm pretty damn sure he was a communist. Now that's whether he was a philanderer who was having orgies um, which we can get into all of that. Most people would say, well, does that matter? And the answer to that question is no, but it says a lot that the individual in this matter, Martin Luther King, um, was involved with such things, and it was covered up for years. And this was something that when we get into it with black conservatives, this becomes the question. You know, is the FBI just smearing this guy? Maybe they're making stuff up, which is I've seen this from a lot of black people that I actually like Maj Toure, you know, um, who have made the statement like, "Hey, why are we believing the FBI? We shouldn't just believe the FBI." It's like, well, let's not get ridiculous. Um, I'm not thrilled about you know believing FBI files, but it does lead to some questions that I think are important questions for us to ask about Martin Luther King and what do we want to know about Martin Luther King? And that's an interesting bit of information because everybody wants to remember the "I Have a Dream" speech and him fighting for the rights of black people. But I am a big proponent of you have to look at people as whole persons. Um, and as whole persons, Martin Luther King may lead people wanting. I kind of jumped off the MLK worship train over a decade ago, and he has left me in an interesting situation because I recognize that a lot of civil rights advocates from the 50s and 60s end up being communists. There's a lot of them. In fact, most of them ended up being communists. And that leads me to believe that, almost the entire civil rights movement is a communist agitation machine. And I don't necessarily like that, but that seems to be what it boils down to. But let's start with, I know Chad Jackson is one of these guys. He's been talking about Martin Luther King a lot. He's been talking about him for over a year, well over a year, probably well over 4 or 5 years. He's been talking about a lot of the things in terms of Martin Luther King. And he was the first one who brought it to my attention that Martin Luther King was probably not as Christian as we are led to believe. And that led to me actually looking into Martin Luther King and reading it for myself and finding out that, hey, he's right about some of these things. That Martin Luther King did question some basic tentpole tenets of Christianity when he was in, I believe, seminary school. This stuff is public knowledge. It is written in Martin Luther King's papers. You can go and find them. I believe it was on Stanford University. Has the stuff where you can download it, and well, not download it, but you can read it. And that was the first thing that really kind of jumped out at me because when I became critical of Jesse Jackson and when I became critical of Al Sharpton, the very first thing I became critical of was when I heard that they were pastors. I would always say, pastors of what church? And then I would listen to what they're saying and seeing if anything you can find Christianity in it. And what you'll find with Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson is 90% politics, over 90% politics. And they will dice up the Bible in order to produce their own politics, produce their own political agenda. And that's problematic for me. I'm not a big fan of that. But of course, you say, okay, well, that's those guys. They're grifters. Vincent Edward Ellison, I believe his name is. He did a 20-minute conversation about Al Sharpton, where you find out that Al Sharpton was a drug dealer in New York. Ended up being a mob rat, and then he became a civil rights advocate with the Toronto Brawley situation. And he just kind of basically became a huge part of the Democratic political machine after that. And so nobody really pays attention to the fact this guy was a former drug dealer who has been pimping Christianity and race politics for 30 years. He's phony as a football bat, and it's pretty obvious to everybody that Al Sharpton is not a real reverend. He's not a real pastor. He learned from Al Sharpton. He is Al Sharpton. He learned from Jesse Jackson, rather, that you can get away with a lot in the black community by cloaking yourself as a reverend. But you don't hear Al Sharpton ever talk about the Bible without talking about politics, especially race politics. So he was the first one to fall, in my view. Even when I was on the left, I was highly critical of Al Sharpton. And then from there, of course, Jesse Jackson was the next to fall, because I started hearing a lot of things about Jesse Jackson that I didn't necessarily like. I learned that Jesse Jackson was anti-abortion, which is the correct position if you were a Christian, but he became pro-abortion because he wanted to run for office. I've read that Jesse Jackson is one of the kings of the shakedown through Operation Push, Operation Push, of going to companies asking for donations, and if they don't give it to them, they will then call the company racist. And you see that, like Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson ran for president. This is going to be an important thing as we talk about Martin Luther King a little bit, that Al Sharpton ran for president, of course, as a Democrat. Didn't work out, obviously. But Jesse Jackson also ran for president in the 80s as a Democrat. Obviously didn't work out. But both of these guys call themselves pastors. They never quote the Bible. They're never on the right side of the Bible, meaning that you as an individual can pick up the Bible, read it, and come to the same conclusions that Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson came up to. You can almost never, ever do that, because most of their teachings is about politics, not about the Bible itself, or Jesus, or even God as a nebulous concept that some people kind of hide behind. So that becomes a huge situation there. So Jesse Jackson was a guy that I wasn't necessarily a big fan of. So it went from Al Sharpton, don't like him, Jesse Jackson, don't like him either. But Martin Luther King, he's not like them. You know, Jesse Jackson was a big fat liar who claims that he was covered in Martin Luther King's blood. And this has been written in books by, Michael Eric Dyson, as he, of course, lionizes Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and all these guys as being the spiritual sons of Martin Luther King. And one of the big stories that has been told is that Jesse Jackson was on the rooftop, on the balcony when Martin Luther King was shot, and he was covered in King's blood and all this kind of stuff. But it seems like he was an opportunist who, once Martin Luther King was shot, he figured, I'm next. It's my turn now. He's going to pick up the mantle and run with it, and he did. So Reverend Al Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who aren't known for being a part of any church individually, but they use the term reverend as a way to get authority in the black community. They're mostly race grifters. Al Sharpton is just a straight up criminal, but I didn't really look into the background of Jesse Jackson that closely. But they're all criminals. Like, he's an extortionist, and they're race grifters. But then you got Martin Luther King, who is in sort of the precursor to all of this, who wasn't as much of a race drifter as Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. You know, Al Sharpton was out there calling white people crackers and being an agitator, like an open agitator. Jesse Jackson was the same way. They wanted to attack white America and promote Black Power and all this kind of stuff. But Martin Luther King was always promoting people working together, you know. And you never got a sense that Martin Luther King was going after white people. You know, you got a sense that he was an individual who saw wrongs and had the strength to right the wrongs. And I've listened over the years to various, specifically white conservatives, attack Martin Luther King as being a plagiarist and a philanderer. And it's easy to write that stuff off as, well, these are just white people who are racist, you know? Like, these people are racist. And I mean, it's easy to say that and then just hand wave it. You never have to actually tackle it. And this is what brings me to when I saw that they were declassifying the MLK files, is because I had been already becoming disillusioned with Martin Luther King. Like I said, about 10 years ago, I stopped really paying too much attention to Martin Luther King Day and all this "I have a dream" and Martin Luther King was a hero stuff, because I was more aware. But there were still things that I didn't know. And because of people like Chad O. Jackson, I am far more aware and far more hip to Martin Luther King than I ever had been before. But I still remain in the center, because I do question what the government that the government is being honest when it comes to Martin Luther King. Because Martin Luther King has, and was challenging the government. So I am questionable about whether Martin Luther King is the person that everybody says he is. But there are certain things that are just absolutely clear that you can't get away from. And that is that Martin Luther King did deny the divinity of Jesus. It is in his writings. He denied Jesus' resurrection. He denied Jesus' virgin birth. And those are pillars of Christianity. And once I started reading that kind of stuff for myself, and then I realized that Martin Luther King was surrounded by communists, and the civil rights movement in general you couldn't throw a rock at one of these marches without hitting a communist in the head. It became pretty clear to me that at the very least, Martin Luther King was a communist puppet. And so whether he's a philanderer who is engaging in orgies with gospel singers and watching his friends sexually assault prostitutes, all that, you put all that to the side. The fact is, the man was not what he said he was. He was not a full believer in traditional Christianity, which we'll go through that in a second. Which means, like, what kind of reverend was he? Again, if he was denying Jesus' divinity, the virgin birth, and the resurrection, what kind of pastor was he at that point? And then a lot of the other side some of the Maj Tourés and the Hotep Dubes, these guys who I really respect, they're very defensive of Martin Luther King, obviously. Hotep Dubes recently posted what Martin Luther King had to say about communism, which comes from, I believe it was a sermon that he had written or performed. I also have it in physical form in the book called Strength to Love, where Martin Luther King talked about his view of communism and can a Christian be a communist? And you have people, again, good historian, good guy like Hotep Dube saying, look, hey, this guy has rejected communism. He wrote against it. But then you have to say, was that just public relations? Was it good public relations for him to just stand up and say, I'm not a communist? Meanwhile, he was pushing for communism, essentially, or socialism at the very least. And you had the Poor People's Program, right? Which was, socialistic in aim and goal. But let's talk about, Martin Luther King's Christianity for a second, because I posted some clips of this stuff online, but I'm gonna, because I read through a lot of his written works from 1949 to 1950. So Martin Luther King wrote in a paper, the Humanity and Divinity of Jesus. He wrote, the conflict that Christians often have over the question of Jesus' divinity is not over the validity of the fact of his divinity, but over the question of how and when he became divine. The more orthodox Christians have seen his divinity as inherent quality metaphysically bestowed. Jesus, they have told us, is the pre-existent logos. He is the word made flesh. He is the second person of the Trinity. He is the very God, of one substance with the Father, who for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate, be the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary. The Orthodox attempt to explain the divinity of Jesus in terms of an inherent metaphysical substance within him seems to me quite inadequate. To say that the Christ whose example of living we are bid to follow is divine is an ontological I'm gonna get this through this one. Ontological sense is actually harmful and detrimental. To invest this Christ with such supernatural qualities makes this rejoinder. Oh well, he had a better chance for that kind of life than we can possibly have. In other words, one could easily use this as a means to hide behind his failures, so that the orthodox view of divinity of Christ is, in my mind, quite readily denied. The true significance of the divinity of Christ lies in the fact that his achievement is prophetic and promissory for every other true son of man who is willing to submit his will to the will and spirit of God. Christ was to only be the prototype of one among many brothers. So he is denying the virgin birth. When he wrote this, he says the orthodox view of the divinity of Christ is, in my mind, quite readily denied. He denied the virgin birth. He does not believe that Jesus was a divine figure. What kind of Christian doesn't believe that Jesus was a divine figure? This is in the Bible, by the way. So he's denying what was written in the Bible. Martin Luther King also denied Jesus' resurrection, This was in a 1959 sermon. He says, "Whatever you believe about the resurrection this morning isn't important. The form that you believe in, that isn't the important thing. The fact that the resurrection is something that nobody can refute, that is the important thing. Some people felt, the disciples felt, that it was a physical resurrection, that the physical body got up. Then Paul came on the scene, who had been trained in Greek philosophy, who knew a little about Greek philosophy, and had read a little, probably of Plato and others who believed in the immortality of the soul. And he tried to synthesize the Greek doctrine of the immortality of the soul with the Jewish Hebrew doctrine of resurrection. And he talked, as you remember and as you read it, about a spiritual body, whatever form, that isn't important right now. The important thing is that the resurrection did occur. The important thing is that the grave was empty. The important thing, I cut off the last part. But he's saying that there was no physical resurrection, that there was a spiritual resurrection, which of course goes against the Bible, where they said that Jesus was physically resurrected. He of course denied the virgin birth. He says, what did I write where I got this from? He says, I put in the tweet that he believes in a demystified Jesus, where he says, again, we may notice the human character of our Lord's moral and religious life. His religious experience was in the human realm. Certainly, he had a human faith in God. As Dr. Burrell has so cogently stated, our Lord's life on earth was a life of faith, and his victory was the victory of faith. His temptations were real temptations, which it was difficult and painful for him to resist. God was in Christ. Jesus overcame his temptations not by reliance on some inherent divine dimension, but by the consistency of his will. So we are moved to the conclusion on the basis of peremptory evidence that Jesus shared fully our human life. The appearance of such a person, more divine and more human than any other, and standing in closest unity at once with God and man, is the most significant and hopeful event in human history. This divine quality, or this unity with God, was not something thrust upon Jesus from above, but it was a definite achievement through the process of moral struggle and self-abnegation. So he is saying that Jesus was not born divine, that he was a human being who became divine through moral struggle and self-abnegation. This is not in the Bible. So when I started reading this stuff for myself, I started to ask questions about what kind of Christian Jesus, Martin Luther King was. Because there are certain things you sign up for when you become a Christian. Believing that Jesus was the Son of God, or God on earth, and that he was, resurrected after he was killed. These things are pretty basic Christianity. This is Christianity 101. And he has rejected those things in favor of a more human Jesus. That Jesus was a profoundly special human being, closer to God than any other human being possible. Almost like if Jesus was Buddha, like he had reached a certain stage of enlightenment or something. That is when you realize. And I was listening to a great podcast, a Martyr Made podcast, right? And when you realize that Jim Jones, the guy who ended up having all of those people commit suicide, uh, he was supposedly a Christian, and he even played some audio on his podcast of Jim Jones, or was it Jeff Jones? It was one of the two. I'm trying to remember what his name was. But they even played some audio of him reportedly being a Christian pastor. But he would often go off on these insane rants about being God himself. And you realize that Christianity was a pretty good vehicle to push socialism and Marxism, and it's been done again and again and again, and even being done today. And you get the idea that Martin Luther King deciding that he's going to deny all the things that are divine about Jesus. Basically saying that taking a materialist position. Materialism often leads people to socialism. All right? And that really woke me up. That was a punch to the face. All right? Because again, I was already kind of questioning Martin Luther King, for about a decade or so. And then about August of last year, I basically just got tired of listening to like Vincent Edward Ellison and Chad Jackson go on and on about these guys going on and on about Martin Luther King. And I was like, I'm gonna look it up for myself, because I think that every person should look into these things for themselves. And so I did, and I found all of these clips that I just read in the various papers that are posted on Stanford's website. And they're not wrong. Here it is in black and white. Martin Luther King denying the divinity of Jesus, denying the virgin birth, denying the resurrection. And this, of course, all this stuff was written before he became nationally known. So I'm like, okay, he clearly is not the person that everybody expects, but that does not mean that he is, a terrible, person, that he engaged in orgies and watched his friend sexually assault a woman and all that stuff. Now, all that stuff is in the FBI files. Now, one of the big hurdles as we about to go through these FBI files, the ones that we have so far, is as a libertarian and as a skeptic when it comes to government, how much weight should I even give the FBI files? I've read FBI files on Tupac, the Black Panther Party. I've read about Martin Luther King. I've read about, the FBI files on obviously Vince McMahon, because I went through that on this channel. On other various groups, for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, just on and on. I've used the FBI files, and pretty much anytime I do research on somebody, especially a historical figure, one of the first things you do is you go to the FBI files, because they have files on pretty much everybody, right? And one of the things that that as a libertarian you want to question the federal government and how much of this they could actually prove, right? Likely they couldn't prove any of it, but here's the important bit. And this was a really great question that somebody asked. Why would the FBI compile all this information and never release it? It never ended up in a magazine, in a book, in the hands of a racist reporter ever. All of this stuff that they supposedly found out about Martin Luther King, it never popped up in any major publication when Martin Luther King was alive. If they really wanted to, if you want to say J. Edgar Hoover and all these guys, they really hated Martin Luther King. They hated him. They hated his guts. They could have destroyed Martin Luther King while he was still alive. In fact, the suicide note that they sent him telling him to kill himself is when they threatened to release all of this stuff, and then he didn't kill himself. But the FBI had all this information, and they did all this research, and then decided we're just going to keep it on file forever. And it wasn't until 2025 that this stuff is going to get declassified. It is interesting to me that is the case. So now I ask the question, what benefit does the FBI have to lie about Martin Luther King in papers that were never released, that were never used against him? Blackmail information that was never made public. I am very questionable about this, but let's go into the FBI files because I know that you guys kind of want to go through this stuff. I'm going to try not to read all of this, but it says the introduction says in 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. has occupied a prominent role in the drive for equal rights for Negroes in the United States. During this critical period of our nation's history, much has depended on him as the individual Negroes in great numbers have looked to for leadership in their drive to achieve equality. Much depends on him still in these times when racial tensions have created an atmosphere of fear and foreboding among many Negroes and whites alike. The course King chooses to follow at this critical time could have momentous impact on the future of race relations in the United States. And for that reason, this paper has been prepared to give some insight into the nature of the man himself, as well as the nature of his views, goals, objectives, tactics, and the reasons therefore. So the federal government started paying attention to this guy because he was leading huge marches, and he's becoming a spiritual and moral leader among Black Americans. Now, if you listen to a lot of the other folks, they say, well, J. Edgar Hoover and all these guys, they wanted to stop the rise of a Black Messiah, which is blasphemous already, the fact that there would be a Black Messiah. But killing Martin Luther King just turned him into one, turned him into a martyr. To be quite honest, if the more you learn about Martin Luther King, for instance, most people never talk about when Martin Luther King was stabbed in New York. He was stabbed by a Black woman in New York. And I have a book on this. I think when Harlem Nearly Killed King is called. The book is called. It went through when he was stabbed and why the woman stabbed him. I am woefully unprepared because I don't have the book in my hand, nor do I have the book visible. But I believe that the woman just thought he was a troublemaker. Okay, he was making life worse for people, and she thought he was a problem. And you realize that a lot of Black people kind of was similar to that. They just wanted to live their lives normally. They didn't want folks engaging in all of this rabble rousing because it was creating racial tensions where there was none previous. And some people don't want to upset the apple cart. They've gotten used. There are some people who are just used to, yes sir, no sir. When the white man comes around, they don't want, to anybody to upset that. Just let me yes sir, no sir, and that's it. But then you realize, like later on, that Rosa Parks was an op. And this is another thing that when I look at people that I agree with, and like Hotep Dubes and Maj Toure and a couple of other guys, and I say, I don't like being manipulated. I don't like when people are maliciously manipulating the population. I don't look at that as like it's a good thing. Even if it had a quote unquote good outcome, it's agitprop. It's what communists do. So when you see, I think the lady's name was Claudette Colvin, who was the woman who really was kicked off the bus for sitting in the front, but then they decided she was 15 and pregnant with no husband, that she couldn't be the face of that part of the civil rights movement. Then they replaced her with Rosa Parks. Then you say, okay, and then you find out that Rosa Parks' husband was a communist who actually owned a car, and that she had sat in the front of the bus with no problems over a dozen times or whatever, maybe even more, maybe less, with no problems. And they just kept doing this until they got the reaction that they wanted. And you realize that these people are manipulative. And that's when I became really sour on the civil rights movement. And it all fell into place after that. And that's when, like I've on this channel, I have ranted and raved about the Black Panther Party, because a lot of people love the Black Panthers. They don't pay too close attention to, the fact that they were dealing drugs, pimping out the young women, robbing banks, abusing allies, stealing from their allies, killing each other, engaging in all kind of crazy warfare, doing drugs. Some of them were open and honestly rapists, open and honestly racist, open communists, all this sorts of stuff. The veneer had been removed when it comes to the Black Panther Party. See, in the 1940s and 50s, the civil rights movement was a communist plot, but it had the veneer of respectability. You saw men in suits. You saw poor Black people being put upon in the streets. Water hoses being turned on them, racist police officers, regular racist folks throwing bricks at them. That's what they wanted you to see. That's what they wanted you to see. And then you see in the 60s, you hear about all these shootouts with the cops. You hear about all these, the young Black man, what was his name, Fred Hampton, who was killed in his apartment while he was asleep. You hear about Mumia Abu-Jamal and all these guys who are arrested for getting in shootouts with police officers, and they were innocent. And the only reason they're in prison is because of a racist white system. And I remember looking into the Mumia Abu-Jamal case and thinking, he asked for a guy named John Africa to be his attorney. John Africa is not an attorney. John Africa was a cult leader in Philadelphia. He was the leader of some kind of the MOVE movement. The MOVE bombing in Philadelphia in 1980s, where the Philadelphia Police Department dropped like a napalm bomb on a house that had children in it, which did occur. That did happen. But the idea that John Africa started that fight, nobody ever had told me that. So again, I grew up with a lot of these woke sentiments that the government is evil. And oh my God, they murdered children in Waco. They murdered children in the MOVE house maybe a decade or so prior in Philadelphia. And then you realize, like, at least in the MOVE situation, and probably in Waco as well, the people inside the house is the ones who started shooting at the cops. And you're like, holy shit. And then you see a lot of other situations like the Black Liberation Army and these people who were going out assassinating police officers. Some of them were just like on break, sitting in the car, getting shot for no reason. And then people are lionizing that sort of thing. And you're like, holy hell, like, what are these people that I am being told are the heroes of this story? And it all springs from the fact that you learn more about the situation and you just don't take the surface level story of the situation. Asada Shakur is another one. They talk all these stories about how she, I think she gave birth in prison, and no, that was Afeni Shakur. Asada Shakur is the young lady who escaped prison, ended up in Cuba, but she was in the middle of a shootout with the police, and she ended up getting struck. I believe she also have given birth in prison. And you realize that that's what they did. They rode around and started fights with the cops. And sometimes the cops caught them doing something illegal, like, illegal possession of handguns, which, I'm not in favor of that law existing. Or they got caught or were suspicious of like robbing banks or engaging in drug dealing or something like that. And these things will end up in firefights all the time. And you realize that all of this stuff is agitprop. It's all just socialists and communists going out here starting fights, and then they have the best PR machine in the world because people dislike the government. And so me being critical of like the FBI files comes from the fact that I read all this stuff when I was a kid, and a lot of it ends up being the FBI is full of shit. You hear about the COINTELPRO program, counterintelligence program. How the federal government infiltrated the civil rights movement. They infiltrated the Black Panther Party. They infiltrated the mob too. They infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan as well. Nobody feels bad when the Ku Klux Klan are infiltrated and COINTELPRO. Nobody said, oh, well, it wasn't real. It was racism. It wasn't racism when they infiltrated the mafia. I'm pretty sure everybody's heard of Donnie Brasco, right? Nobody's ever said that was racist. It's only racist when the FBI and the government gets involved with the civil rights movement. And then you start seeing people who are like regular housewives who ended up being part of the civil rights movement and came back saying, yo, there's nothing but communists in this thing. It's a communist front group. But this was in the 1950s and nobody paid it any attention. And then also because you are fed, you get discounted. Nobody wants to hear it because you're fed. And then you see how that hand waving that people do is actually thought killing. All right. And that thought killing prevents you from actually doing research and thinking about the situation in totality. So when these FBI documents came out and people was talking about Martin Luther King, or at least when they were resurfaced and people started talking about Martin Luther King, one of the first things you saw is everything that the feds say is a lie. So you don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to consider that it might be true. You can just say, oh, it's COINTELPRO. It's made up monkey shit, COINTELPRO. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to read it. You read it, it's not true. Well, some of this stuff is 50, 60 years old. It can't really hurt you now. Now we can look at it with the benefit of hindsight. Now, maybe in 1967 or something like that, if we'd have read this then, we'd have been like, okay, nah, the government's on some bullshit, right? But it's 2025. Martin Luther King has been dead since 1968. What is the benefit of just accepting that Martin Luther King was being lied on by the government? And then you realize that most of this stuff, as heinous as it was, almost none of it ever made it to print. Why didn't they give it to a sympathetic reporter to smear him in the media? Which they could have done. They could have destroyed the civil rights movement by doing that. But they didn't do it. Interesting. Let's go through this. I didn't forget. So, the Washington Spring Project. It says Martin Luther King Jr., president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, has stated publicly that he and 3,000 of his followers will march on Washington, D.C. this spring. He has announced that he will lead a massive civil disobedience campaign that will disrupt the normal course of business and, in fact, close down the nation's capital. He originally announced this project on August 15th, 1967, in Atlanta, Georgia, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King predicted that this massive civil disobedience will be more effective than riots. Concerning civil disobedience, King declared, quote, "To dislocate the function of a city without destroying it can be more effective than a riot, because it can be longer lasting, costly to society, but not wantonly destructive." King has referred to this campaign as the Washington Spring Project and the Poor People's March, which is reportedly being staged to pressure Congress into passing legislation favorable to the Negro. It is King's contention that the government of the United States does not move until it is confronted dramatically. To add to this dramatic confrontation, King has boasted he and his entourage are coming to Washington to stay, that his followers will conduct sit-ins, camp-ins, and sleep-ins at every government facility available, including the lawn of the White House. He has bragged that he will fill up the jails of Washington and surrounding towns. That's very interesting. His idea is to put a ton of black people in jail. Think about that. His plot is to fill up the jails with black people in the hopes that it will force the government to pass policy. Interesting. So they start talking about his connections with people like Stokely Carmichael. We don't need to go through this. I gotta cut some of this stuff down. All right, so it says strong communist influence. One of King's principal advisors is Stanley David Levison. Ostensibly only a New York City attorney and businessman, Levison is in fact a shrewd, dedicated communist. Levison has spent the major part of his life advancing communist interests. Levison gravitated to Martin Luther King Jr. in 1956. He has been a dedicated in his support of King as he has been advancing communist goals. He has actively involved himself in fundraising drives for King, served as his legal counsel in certain matters, suggested speech material for him, like the I Have a Dream speech, which is not in here, but it's been widely reported that Stanley Levison probably wrote that speech. He says, for King served as his legal counsel, suggested speech material, discussed with King demonstrations in which King was involved, guided him in regard to acceptance or rejection of certain public appearances and speaking commitments, and it helped him with matters related to the articles and books King has prepared. So that means that this guy has been next to King for everything King wrote and everything that King spoke. Stanley Levison was there. So that means this book that I have, Strength to Love, where Martin Luther King talks about Christianity and communism, Stanley Levison had some hand in this, or some hand in the sermons and articles written there in this book. So when people say, like, Hotep Dubes, who again I respect very much, that Martin Luther King was anti-communist, how could that be when a communist is helping him at every single step? Every single step. And it wasn't that Martin Luther King didn't know Stanley Levison was a communist. He did know that. It's difficult to prove what people know, though. I can say that. He said, Levison edited most of the chapters of King's new book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Levison wrote one chapter of this book and the publisher's representative complained to King and Levinson that it was obvious certain sections of the book were written by different individuals. I want to pause right here as well because I want to talk about the idea that somebody is writing on Martin Luther King's behalf. This is not the first time this stuff has happened. You probably have realized that if you go back further in history, there were these things called slave narratives, right? Where supposedly slaves were writing books like Harriet Jacobs, right? These people were supposedly slaves writing books about their harrowing experience as slaves. And then you have to think about it, and then you find out later on, most of these people were illiterate. They couldn't write. So it was actually white liberals writing those books on the behalf of the slave and obviously embellishing material. I forgot how many people got busted doing this, but essentially abolitionists who were technically the good guys in that situation, they were slapping the slave's name onto a book. And the slaves did not write the book. They wrote the book. So this kind of manipulation has been happening for a long time to black people. There's always been, this white guy. In this situation, it sounds like Stanley Levinson was Jewish. Might have been a black, Jewish guy or something like that. I don't remember what he looks like. And he's writing things on King's behalf. No different than an abolitionist writing a book for an illiterate slave. At least in that situation, the abolitionist can say, hey, look, they can't read or write. I have to write it for them because they can't read or write for themselves, which is at least fair, right? They want to tell their story, but they can't write. So they come to somebody else, and maybe you could say by dictation, they wrote the book. But because the whole point of publishing slave narratives was to manipulate the legal system and to manipulate the hearts and minds of people, it ended up just being propaganda. And so people today read those books without thinking about that element of it. They read books about people like Harriet Jacobs without considering that Harriet Jacobs could not read or write. How did Harriet Jacobs write a book? She couldn't read or write. So obviously there was an abolitionist that wrote it for her. And the abolitionist likely embellished certain elements of the book in order to get slavery overturned. It was not meant to be a purely historical piece. Like, when Roots, right? Alex Haley wrote the book Roots. And then you find out later on that he lied about certain elements of Roots because it was propaganda. Then you also find out that he wrote the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he fabricated pieces of that as well. Because Malcolm X, I think, died before that book was even published. And then his family, Malcolm X's family, rebuked quite a bit of the autobiography of Malcolm X. And then you started seeing that a lot of people came out with their own biographies of Malcolm X, and they were even worse than the autobiography of Malcolm X. Books that were saying that Malcolm X was a gay male prostitute. We're not going to get into that. So Stanley Levinson has told Clarence Jones, another advisor to King, that under no circumstances should King be permitted to say anything without their approving it. Levinson also informed Jones that King is such a slow thinker, he is usually not prepared to make statements without help from someone. Levinson is actively participating in the planning for King's, quote, Washington Spring Project. So you could obviously write that you see this kind of material again and again when it comes to blacks, especially black males. They don't think you can think for yourself, that you're a puppet. And that's why I really don't, I feel so strongly about this Martin Luther King situation, because if he was a communist and he was thinking for himself, I would be perfectly happy with that. If he was not a communist and he was just allowing people to use his name to push their agenda because he agreed with it, that's sick. It's sick. See, the thing about guys like Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver and all that, they wrote their own shit. Huey Newton was a very smart guy. He ended up being a crackhead, but he was a very, very, very smart guy. Very intelligent. Most of the Black Panthers were very, very, very intelligent. And therefore, they didn't really hide what they believed, because they were smart people. In some ways, they were elitist people. They believed they had the moral high ground on every social issue, and therefore, they really didn't need to lie about who they were and what they were. But Martin Luther King, probably a smart guy, but felt the need to lie about what he believed. Again, he's operating 10 years before the creation of the Black Panther Party. Because, as you pretty well know, the Black Panther Party was sparked up after the death of Malcolm X, which was in 1965. And people are a little bit more honest about what they believe in the 60s than they were in the 50s. They would get even more honest in the 70s. They would become less honest in the 80s, less honest in the 90s, less honest today. The more you learn about communism, to be quite honest, the more people lie about whether they agree with it or not. And it's important that the communist thing is very important. Because in the 50s, you might be able to make an excuse that, so what, he was a communist, which was one of the things that I've heard. It was the 1950s, so what? And you can say, well, okay, yeah, we don't really know the full extent of communist horrors in the 1950s. We don't really know. We got a pretty good idea, but you could be naive. There's no excuse in the 80s. There's no excuse in the 90s. There's no excuse today. But we constantly see that, black males are not fit to lead on their own. Black quarterbacks, need the white coach to tell them what to do. Those sorts of things, right? Can't think for yourself. So they continue in this piece. Communist influence and black nationalists advocating for violence give the Washington Spring Project a potential for an extremely explosive situation. Okay. They give Martin Luther King background. Not going to go into that. Not necessary. Not necessary at all. So Stanley Levinson was attracted to King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when King gained national attention. Levinson soon developed a close relationship with King and was known in King's group as Assistant Chief. Prior to joining forces with King, Levinson led a double life for the Communist Party USA. Outwardly, he was a successful businessman, but he was also the clandestine fundraiser for the Communist Party USA. He was entrusted with raising and handling secret funds for the party and used some of these funds to finance his own activities. It says, through Levinson's influence, other subversives were attracted to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Hunter Pitts Odell, former National Committee member of the Communist Party USA, was employed by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1962, when King mentioned to Levinson that he was thinking of adding an administrative assistant to his staff, Levinson recommended Hunter Pitts Odell, who was then head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's New York office. King said he liked the idea. At the time, King was well aware of Levinson's and Odell's communist affiliations. The reason King enjoyed this close relationship with communists is best explained by the fact that Levinson, in February 1962, passed a word to Gus Hall, General Secretary of the Communist Party USA. King is a wholehearted Marxist who has studied it, Marxism, believes in it, and agrees with it. But because of his being a minister of religion, does not dare to espouse it publicly. Further, in March 1962, Levinson told a Communist Party USA functionary that King was concerned about, quote, a communist label being pinned on us. But that at the time, he wanted to do everything possible to evidence friendship towards the Soviet Union. In addition, King has been described within the Communist Party USA as a true, genuine Marxist-Leninist from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. The feeling within the Communist Party USA at that time was, and still is, that King definitely follows a Marxist-Leninist line. Now, I just talked about this book, Strength to Love. I got it in my hand. Chapter 12 of this book is entitled, How Should a Christian View Communism? Now, we talked earlier about whether Martin Luther King was truly a Christian, right? Denied the virgin birth, denied the divinity of Jesus, denied the resurrection. But he's going to tell a Christian what they should think about communism. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with what he came up with. So what did he come up with? He says the first reason that recognizes the widespread influence of communism, like a mighty tidal wave, spread through Russia, China, Eastern Europe, and now even to our hemisphere. Nearly 1 billion of the peoples of the world believe in its teachings, many of them embracing it as a new religion to which they have surrendered completely, a force which cannot be denied. Ignored. We misspelled ignored. A second reason that communism is the only serious rival to Christianity. A third reason is that it is unfair and certainly unscientific to condemn a system before we know what that system teaches and why it is wrong. He says, let me state clearly the basic premise of this sermon. Communism and Christianity are fundamentally incompatible. A true Christian cannot be a true communist, for the two philosophies are antithetical, and all the dialectics of the logicians cannot reconcile them. So he's saying a true Christian cannot be a communist. This is, in fact, true. This is true. But we question whether Martin Luther King is even really a Christian, right? So he goes on by saying communism is based on a materialistic and humanistic view of life and history. According to communist theory, matter, not mind or spirit, speaks the last word in the universe. Well, when he was talking about the resurrection, he's basically said that it was a spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection. But he goes on to say that Jesus's divinity comes from basically self-struggle and some version of enlightenment, right? So he said communism is based on ethical relativism and accept no moral absolutes. Communism exploits the dreadful philosophy that the ends justify the means. He just said he's going to fill the jails. That's what the FBI report said, right? That Martin Luther King threatened to fill the jails. So the ends justify the means. All these black people can go to jail because the ends is to change the government system. We need to change the laws. Who cares how many people have to go to jail? It says third, communism attributes ultimate value to the state. Man is made for the state and not the state for the man. One may object, saying that in communist theory that the state is an interim reality, which will, quote, wither away when the classless society emerges. True in theory, but it's also true that while it lasts, the state is the end. Man is a means to that end. Man has no inalienable rights. His only rights are derived from and conferred by the state. This is absolutely true. When I read this book, and the first time I ever read it, I would have agreed with everybody who says that Martin Luther King cannot be a communist, because that is a very sharp criticism of communism. Okay? But then I started questioning whether he was really a Christian. And then you find out that he was around communists literally all the time. And then you think about it, how many communist hands did this piece of business that he's writing here, how many did they touch? Did somebody co-write this with him? Is that even true? So it says the ultimate weakness of communism is that it robs man of that quality which makes him a man. It says a man, says Paul Tillich, is man because he is free. This freedom is expressed through man's capacity to deliberate, decide, and respond. Under communism, the individual soul is shackled by the chains of conformity. His spirit is bound by the manacles of party allegiance. He is stripped of both conscience and reason. The trouble with communism is that it is neither a theology nor a Christology. Therefore, it emerges with a mixed up anthropology. Confused about God, it is also confused about man. In spite of its glowing talk about the welfare of the masses, communism's methods and philosophy strip man of his dignity and worth, leaving him as little more than a depersonalized cog in the ever-turning wheel of the state. This does not sound like a man who is a communist. Right? How do you have communist friends if you believe that? How are at least two of your very close advisors communists, and you come to that understanding? You understand communism so much that you can write that, and yet you're surrounded by communists. How could that be? Now you understand my confusion about Martin Luther King? Let's go back to the FBI report. It says King was forced to get rid of Hunter Pitts Odell in October 1962 when several newspaper articles exposed Odell's connection with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and his communist affiliations. So, King, at least at one point, realized that one of the people he was around was a communist, and he got rid of him. Interesting. But that was only for public relations. He says Odell's connection with Southern Christian Leadership Conference and his communist affiliations. King still tried to hide Odell in his organization until July of 1963, when he accepted Odell's resignation. As King puts it, Odell's release was not because of his connections between Odell and the Communist Party USA, but because of the emotional public response. Odell has continued his efforts to make his presence felt in the civil rights movement in behalf of the Communist Party USA. Winter 1967 issue of Freedom Ways, self-described as a review of the Negro freedom movement. These are already free people, by the way. This is post-slavery. Years post-slavery. They're talking about a freedom movement. Lists Odell as an associate managing director. Actually, Freedom Ways is a Communist Party USA initiated and Communist Party USA supported publication espousing the communist viewpoint of Negro problems. It says, King speaks at a rally honoring a communist. The communist was Jack Odell, which he says is the popular name used by Hunter Pitts Odell, was also listed as one of the speakers at this affair. Bayard Rustin, who I think was gay, is a former advisor to King and one-time secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Rustin has publicly admitted affiliation with the communist movement in the late 1930s. not going to read all of this stuff. Just going to skim through it from there. Because it's a lot of communists, bro. This is a whole lot of fucking communists. A whole lot. So it says, what are the objectives of the communists in terms of United States? So during the 1960s, the Communist Party USA was striving to obtain a Negro labor coalition to achieve its goals in the country. At the time, the Communist Party USA party line was big business attacks on the rights of labor are continuing. In order to defeat this offensive, organized labor, assisted by communists, must launch a counter-crusade, which can only succeed if it is based on the united action of the entire trade union movement. Communists had also recognized the error of their ways by proclaiming that the communist program for self-determination of the Negro in the Black Belt area of the South had been discarded. The new policy was to seek complete economic, political, and social equality for the Negro with all other American citizens. That doesn't sound too bad. In May 1961, the communist newspaper The Worker stated, quote, "Communists will do their utmost to strengthen and unite the Negro movement and bring it to the backing of the working people." Huh. That don't sound too bad. Martin Luther King and his organization were made to order to achieve these objectives. King and his group were demonstrating and conducting voter registration campaigns to align the Negro movement solidly behind King. They started talking about the peace movement now, and King as role as a peacemaker, which led to him talking to like Ho Chi Minh and stuff, right? Him being anti-Vietnam, him going on television, him sitting in front of the Senate hearings, all these sorts of things. And I'm trying to find the important bit that would explain why they never put this information out, because I've been talking about this stuff for a long time now. And here it is. It is on page 15 of the 23 pages that we have out so far. The fringe element of Levinson referred to was attempting to persuade King to run for president. Now, when I started this whole rant, I talked about what? Al Sharpton became a Democrat, ran for president. Go backwards, Jesse Jackson became a Democrat, ran for president. Now we hear, for the first time, and I've never heard this before, that the communists wanted Martin Luther King to run for president. Now, it doesn't take a super genius to figure it out from here, right? That the FBI had all this information on Martin Luther King and they didn't put it out. They were waiting for him to run for president. And then they were going to put it out. All this stuff about the orgies and the sex and all that stuff was going to come out if he decided to run for president. He didn't live long enough. But they knew they were talking about it because it's right here. It says April 19th, 1967, Levinson and Wachtel conferred concerning King's political possibilities. According to Wachtel, a pacifist group was meeting that day in an effort to get King to agree to run for president with Dr. Benjamin Spock, the anti-war agitator, as his vice presidential candidate. Both Levinson and Wachtel agreed that it was too early and that King should not agree to run at this time. The Communist Party USA again seized the opportunity to cause dissension and unrest in the country by announcing that they would support King and Spock on a peace ticket. At May Day 1967 program in Berkeley, California, Gus Hall stated the party forces should begin work right now to elect these two men because they are for peace in Vietnam. Now, of course, Martin Luther King was vehemently anti-Vietnam War. It says early May 1967, Levinson was still concerned with King's being identified with the peace movement rather than civil rights. When approached by the peace groups attempting to get King to continue to run for president, Levinson informed those representatives that King would talk on Vietnam on occasion to various groups, but that would be the extent of his involvement. So, in an effort to evaluate his position, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference held a retreat in Frogmore, South Carolina on May 21, 1967, to determine the relationship of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to the peace movement. King and other top functionaries concluded that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference would give no overt or covert support to anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. They were talking about running this guy for president. Now, they run for president every 4 years. I believe 68 was a election year. I believe 1972 was an election year. 1976, 1980, 1984, 1988, 1992, 1996, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, 2024, right? So they didn't want him to run for president in 1968, which means they were ramping up to have him run for president in 1972. But he got killed in 1968, right? So the plan was likely to get Martin Luther King to run for president in 1972. King, before he died, was able to have meetings in the White House. He was as close to the president as any normal man could possibly be. He had a great deal of influence in American politics. He was extremely well known and was essentially a beloved figure, mostly. Or most people would have, some people just kind of, saw him as, I wouldn't say he was the Jesse Jackson or the Al Sharpton of his day, because he was less a grifter than those guys were. You don't hear too much about Martin Luther King shaking down, corporations or anything like that. But the goal was to try to make this guy president, which would explain why they needed him to be pristine. They needed his image to be perfect. And they figured that the communists had their hands in the pot, they could run the country through Martin Luther King. Now, could he have won the presidency? I don't think the FBI would have allowed it. They definitely would have dumped all this stuff if he'd have decided to run for president. But I can tell, just from looking at it, that's what they were waiting for. So when I asked people, what was the point of the government creating all of this information and never putting it out, never leaking it to a newspaper? It's because, to be quite honest, the Civil Rights Act, it was not at the time what it became decades later. The Civil Rights Act is one of the most economically destructive, socially destructive as well, laws ever put on the books. It is absolutely horrific for individual rights and individual liberties. It has allowed the federal government to have almost unrestrained power in terms of discrimination law and control over individual companies, not just in who they serve, but now who they hire, who they can fire. The Civil Rights Act has just become an absolute albatross around the neck of our economic system. But it wasn't at the time. It probably seemed like a good idea at the time, because you're banning discrimination. Then you have to realize that discrimination is a human right. You probably never heard that before. It probably hurts your heart to hear that, but you have the right to refuse to do business with people. You have the right to refuse to let people into social clubs. You have the right to refuse, or private social clubs. You have the right to refuse to associate with people. You have the right to discriminate. And nobody should tell you who you can and cannot discriminate against. The government shouldn't be making that argument. Well, it's okay if you discriminate against pedophiles. And at least for now, soon they're probably going to flip that. And you can't discriminate against pedophiles. But originally it was just race. Then it became gender. Then it became sexuality. Then it became sexual orientation. Then it became gender. And then it became age. You know? Can't discriminate against. So now you have, and I just saw this the other day, and it really just kind of made me shake my head. A security guard, which was obviously a woman in her mid-50s with a cane. She was a security guard. What is she protecting? What can somebody's meemaw who can't even walk on her own going to protect? These are just filler jobs, right? It's not a real job at that point. She's a lookout. She can't chase anybody. She's not going to tackle anybody. She doesn't have a gun because none of these security guards have guns. A middle-aged black woman with a cane is not going to make a good security guard. But if you say you can't discriminate based off age and race and gender, well, then she's got 3 of those. She gets the job. So if you come to steal anything and you see Meemaw sitting there with a cane, you don't have to put too much effort into taking whatever the fuck you want. So 9 times out of 10, she ain't protecting nothing of value. Which means her job doesn't really need to exist. Because she can't protect it. She can't walk on her own. This is basic common sense shit here. All this stuff about diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that shit comes from the Civil Rights Act. Right? It's all just next level affirmative action. It's never ending. Affirmative action was the step after the Civil Rights Act. Oh, civil rights are not enough. We have to have affirmative action. Then affirmative action was not enough. We have to have a DEI program. All these things is never enough. And it's always about giving the government more power. So then you say, well, Mongo, you talked a lot about communism. Isn't that what Martin Luther King talked about, was how man was, a wheel in the cog of the state, not an individual? It's almost like civil rights law, affirmative action programs, DEI was all about expanding the power of the state. How could that be? That wasn't an accident, by the way. That's by design. That's by design. There's a lot of stuff here. I didn't even get into any of the sex stuff because, again, I don't care about whether he was having sex with weird individuals. Clara Ward, which was poor Clara Ward, her name ended up in here. She's a gospel singer. Joan Baez is in here. There's talks about Martin Luther King having a baby out of wedlock in February of 1968. I mean, it's just all kind of really, really weird stuff in here. Again, to me, the subversive element is the worst part. Not the orgies and the sex and all that. I don't care about that. I care about the malicious forces that was using Martin Luther King to reshape American society. I care about agitprop, how people have used individuals like Martin Luther King to cause division and racial strife in the United States. I care about the massive amounts of government power that came from the murder of Martin Luther King. To be quite honest, the memory of Martin Luther King has did far more damage than if he had become president. If he'd have become president in 1972, he would not. He would have a incredibly limited ability to do anything. But as a martyr, he can do anything. He could be for anything. You can invoke the name of Martin Luther King for anything. I'm not one of these people who say Martin Luther King shouldn't have a holiday. I don't care what they make holidays for. I'll take the day off, whatever. But I don't like communists. I don't like communism. I don't like the agitprop. I absolutely hate the idea of me picking up a book or thinking that somebody I was told as a hero was just a puppet for other people. I hate that. I despise it. But it's happened again and again and again. And it only really happens when you listen to the liberal worldview. You almost never find some secret white man behind crazy black conservatives. They try to find them, most certainly. You know, people thought like, oh, Candace Owens, she's nuts. That's just her husband talking. Her husband's like a really normal guy. Candace is just fucking crazy, okay? But they do that shit all the time. You know? They talk about all these people that are controlling the various, rappers and especially when they stopped, playing I hate to use the term democratic plantation, but when they get off of that, it's almost always how, the white man is controlling them and all this kind of shit. In reality, they're doing exactly what they claim that all of the blacks, the black conservatives are doing. They're the ones controlling the black liberals. And then it becomes pretty obvious too when you think about it, how so many of these guys get caught up, like that Ibram X. Kendi. The guy's a moron. All right, he's just plain stupid. There's so many black liberals, especially the new black public intellectuals of the last 20 or 30 years or so. They're profoundly stupid people. All right, Ta-Nehisi Coates. They sound very smart. If you're looking at it from the surface level, they sound extremely smart. But if you crack just a little bit beneath the veneer of how they sound, because they learned how to write in college and they learned how to speak very well, if you actually engage with their arguments, they don't know that much about stuff. They don't know that much about anything, really. And then you find people who are not traditionally intellectuals, like a Chad O. Jackson or a Vincent Edward Ellison. They're not traditionally intellectuals, but they're good researchers and they can think. And things don't always come out perfect. But what they're saying is actually far more accurate. And if you engage with it, you'll find that it's mostly solid. As opposed to the public intellectuals that they drag onto television who try to preach to you about history. And then you find out, I could bust this guy's argument with a Google search. I don't even need to read the whole article. Like, he just comes out and just says stupid things. And they just make up shit. The 1619 Project. They just made up shit. Again, I remember reading in a book written by Benjamin Quarles about the slaves that came, or the indentured servants who came to the Americas before 1619, well, in 1619 rather. I remember reading about that in a history book. They were not slaves. Why didn't she know this? She's supposed to be a historian. And she didn't know that according to, I think it's British law, Christians cannot hold each other in slavery. And those blacks who came with them to England, from England to the United States in 1619 were Christians. Therefore, they could not have been slaves. Wow. Again, this was written before she was born. What books was she reading? Did she read any books? Probably not. Benjamin Quarles died in 1996. I just looked it up. His book, The Negro in the Making of America, was written in 1965. So that means that the 1619 Project was debunked in 1965. That woman did not read anything. She's an idiot. It was debunked before she even made the argument. She is an idiot. And again, I read that in 2014, 2015. How long have I had that book? I got this book out of what, when they used to have these big library sales where they'll sell a book for $1 or $2 or whatever, right? I probably bought it then, and I probably bought like 3 dozen books at one time or something like that. And he's a black historian, so it's not an issue of, oh, you read some kind of white historian, Mongo. No, Benjamin Quarles is black. That's why I picked up the book. I told you, it used to be woke. I want to read a black historian. These people don't get it, man. They're looking at you, and they're goddamn fools. So many of them are stupid. Just profoundly stupid people. Some people are just wrong, and they maybe don't know they were wrong. They're emotionally attached to people like Martin Luther King. They're emotionally attached to stuff like the 1619 Project or Black Lives Matter or the Black Panther Party. And look, having been there and done that, I understand. I understand being emotionally attached to those people. But you gotta let it go. You gotta realize you don't know those people. You do not know those people. And the folks who are telling you that they were heroes, most of them are scumbags. And then you have to look at what the outcome was. When you talk about what the outcome was of the civil rights movement, of the legacy of Martin Luther King, it was a gross expansion of the federal government, welfare programs, and the loss of the ability to discriminate in your private business, which some people think is a good thing, but I don't. I think that people should be able to discriminate. That's going to make people feel uncomfortable, but it's true. I do. I think you should be able to discriminate. I think you discriminate all day, any day, every day anyway. Some people don't like Uber. That's a discrimination. Some people don't like Lyft. That's a discrimination. Some people say, well, I will never use DoorDash because I don't think that people should be able to order coffee while they're at work and treat other people as, what did somebody call it? A coffee taxi or something like that. They have a moral objection to DoorDash and stuff like that. It's weird. Who cares? But you're discriminating when you do that. You discriminate all day, every day. You discriminate in your personal life. You decided that there are certain women or men or whatever that you won't date. And you discriminate by age and race and sexual orientation and economic status. Don't date broke bitches. Okay? Never do that. That's a tough one to get through. You do that all day, but now you say that discrimination is wrong, that you can't do that. People do it all the time. You do it all the time. And they'll create these scenarios. I remember having a conversation with somebody online. They created this scenario where I was talking about who cares if people want to discriminate. They would say, well, if you were riding around in the backwoods of a town in 1960 or whatever. And there was only one hotel in the entire town. They said no Negroes. What are you going to do? Don't you think that's, or they'll say, what about if you were shot and the hospital says no blacks? I'm like, that would be tough. That would be extremely tough. But can you point to me an actual historical situation where that happened more than once? Or to be quite honest, if you stayed with the rest of the blacks, you wouldn't have that problem. You only have that problem if you live around white people, which was the goal, was to keep you away from living around white people. I mean, I get it. Life was not convenient for our grandparents and our great grandparents. It was not fun. And people wanted to change the world. People always want to change the world. Just an innate desire to want to inflict the environment and to leave a legacy. But there should be limits to this. And I think we reached our limit and went beyond it. So when I see Trump, getting rid of DEI programs and stripping away affirmative action, that's just a step in the right direction. You're not going to lose anything. You're the same person today as you were yesterday. If you weren't qualified for the job yesterday, you ain't qualified today. If you lose that job, you probably weren't qualified in the first place. I had no intention to talk about Martin Luther King this whole goddamn night. I really didn't. But it seemed like that's what happened. So. All right. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by. Let's see if there's any questions or anything like that before I go on. What's up with your Pastor Sewell? I don't know that much about the guy. I saw the really cringe sermon he did when he's doing a fake ass Martin Luther King. I can't stand that. I hate it so much. Oh, I don't know. And then he started running a crypto scheme or some shit. God, it's typical Detroit, right? Get a little positive press, and then you turn around and Detroit the shit out of it. Did I hear about Gothics joining the Rippaverse? Is it interesting? I have not followed any of that stuff. I did see that they're teaming up, but I don't know what she's doing. As far as I know, she's a political commentator. I don't know if she's an artist or anything like that. How many black conservatives went from Frederick Douglass to Clarence Thomas? How have they went from there? I think part of it is well, it depends on what you mean, because Frederick Douglass is mostly self-educated, but he was a person who was all about his own struggle for freedom, and he lived in a different time. So when you talk about Frederick Douglass, this guy was a slave. He was born a slave. Same thing with Booker T. Washington. Their perspectives on the world are going to be profoundly different from people who were not born slaves. So that's already going to be a huge difference. But when you talk about what Frederick Douglass believes versus what Clarence Thomas believed, Frederick Douglass wanted the United States to live up to his credo that, all these truths are self-evident about, what is like when he wrote what is July 4th to the Negro? Like, that was a question of, hey, can you fix the problems that still exist on the color line issue? Like, the America is not perfect, and I don't think Clarence Thomas believes that it is. But Frederick Douglass never would have thought that the United States would basically provide for you, feed you, clothe you, give you free health care and all that kind of shit. Because as a slave, he had all of that. That's the thing that really kind of bothers me, that when people don't think about it. It's like, As a slave, Frederick Douglass was provided for. Somebody fed him. Somebody clothed him. Somebody decided what he needed to know and what he didn't need to know. They gave him a religion. He had everything that he needed as a slave, but he didn't have freedom. He couldn't exercise. He couldn't speak as he wanted to speak. He couldn't say no. He wasn't really free to move around. Those were the things that he sought. Those are the things that Clarence Thomas is trying to maintain. When he goes out there and he has these conservative opinions, he's thinking about not what Frederick Douglass was arguing, because he can't make the same arguments as Frederick Douglass. But he's saying, hey, the Constitution is the law of the land. You should live up to the Constitution. The government doesn't need to have that much authority, that much power. Frederick Douglass didn't even get that far. He was just saying, hey, the Constitution is the law of the land. It should apply to Negroes too. You should respect our rights as you respect the rights of other white people. I don't think Clarence Thomas would disagree with that in one bit. What Clarence Thomas is standing against is usually these special quota systems and cutouts specifically for blacks. And if you actually pay attention to why he feels that way because he doesn't think black people need them. That putting black people in positions where they can't achieve is not beneficial to black people or the individual person, which is a fact. I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have, though. It says Chad Jackson's working on an MLK documentary. Yes, I saw. He put up like 20 or 30 minutes of it last week, and I watched it. What are my thoughts on Michael Eric Dyson? He was one of the people I actually looked forward to. I actually liked Michael Eric Dyson. I give him a lot of credit for making me somewhat political, because I remember seeing him during the Bush years, and he was sharp. He's from Detroit too, so I was like, oh shit, this was great. And then I read more of his books, and I listened to him, and I started listening to people who I watched him go after with great fervor, Bill Cosby. And then I saw him with the Obama situation. That's where I lost respect for him. I lost respect for him quite a few times, and now I think he's a clown. But the first thing I lost respect for him for was he was being criticized by Cornel West, who had been his friends for 20 years or so. They had written tons of articles together. They had done interviews together all the time. They were brothers. It was like a big brother, little brother situation, or maybe even like a Cornel West was like an uncle to Michael Eric Dyson. And then Michael Eric Dyson, because Cornel West was criticizing Obama, and he was criticizing Michael Eric Dyson too, he wrote like a 10,000 word essay completely destroying Cornel West. And essentially, that was, if you believe in the occult sacrifice gimmick that everybody talked about, that took Michael Eric Dyson from a guy who occasionally is on television to be a guy being on TV all the fucking time. He had to cut off and basically intellectually kill Cornel West. I lost a ton of respect for him right there. Again, I lost respect for both of them in that situation. But Michael Eric Dyson became an absolute clown because he was not consistent. A lot of the stuff that him and Cornel West agreed on, Michael Eric Dyson compromised on because he wanted to be close to Obama. Cornel West, you could say he was rejected by Obama, so therefore he became more hypercritical, which I guess technically is true. But he was still relatively consistent. But then Cornel West took a couple of L's, because not only did he get destroyed verbally in written form by Michael Eric Dyson, but then Tavis Smiley got Me Too'd, who was like, that became his new running buddy. Even though Tavis Smiley was always there, Tavis Smiley got Me Too'd and pretty much they nuked him from orbit. So that was it for him. And so now Cornel West is kind of run for president, and the two guys that he was known to hang around for 40 years wasn't around. Even though I think he did write a book, The Rich and the Rest of Us, with Tavis Smiley. I think that was before Tavis Smiley got canceled, though. But that was one of the major issues with me and Michael Larry Dyson. And then the thing that really made me lose respect for him and say that he was a clown was he found out his brother was in prison. And I forget who it was, CNN, Fox, somebody like that. They interviewed Michael Larry Dyson while he was with his brother. This has been, I think, scratched from the internet because I have not been able to find it. I've talked about it on this channel half dozen times. I have not been able to find it. But Michael Larry Dyson is with his brother. And they're talking about racism. And I believe the white guy's an interviewer. I don't know if it was a white guy or a white woman, or maybe it's somebody black. And they're like, you know, you guys were raised in the same house, went to the same schools or whatever. How is it that he ended up in prison and you didn't? And then Michael Larry Dyson was kind of stuck for a second. And then he said, I'm a couple of shades lighter. So he started saying, like, basically, because his brother is dark skinned, his brother is in prison. And I'm thinking to myself, this is quite frankly one of the stupidest fucking things I've ever heard. This is a stupid fucking excuse for why your brother is in prison. Not because to say individual decisions is led to individual outcomes would have made him look bad, you know? But if you say that it's color, if it's colorism, then it's an excuse. That the race excuse goes on forever. That's embarrassing. That's really embarrassing. That's fucked up. And I realized at that point he couldn't think. Like he was just spewing talking points. And then after that was the Jordan Peterson thing, but that was like 2 or 3 years ago. So I was already on Michael Eric Dyson as a clown. And that just proved it, that he's bloviating and he says a whole lot of words, but he ain't really saying nothing in general. I really wish I could find that video of him and his brother. I'm looking at it on the Internet Archive. I'm looking for it right now. I'm about to look up what his brother's name is. Because I want to play that audio. It's the silliest thing. I think everybody should do some research on all these people. Oh, his brother passed away. I didn't know that. His brother's name was Everett. Oh wait, is it Michael Dyson CNN? Michael Dyson CNN. Let's say colorism. The problem is with this guy is he's gone on television and talked so much that it's hard to get in there and find something. Look for something specific, you know. Shit. I'm probably never gonna find that fucking clip, but I remembered it, and y'all know my memory is not the best. So if I fucking remembered it, then it absolutely happened. It absolutely happened. That shit was traumatic. Oh, the Internet Archive only goes back to 2009. No wonder I can't find it. I'm pretty sure it was before 2009. Oh, do. I don't know how to use the internet shit. I don't know. You said, "Can you imagine MLK being president? Wasn't that the end goal?" Yeah, that's what it sounded like. That was the end goal, and that's what it seemed like the FBI was prepared for. Is for him to run for president. I can imagine him being president. Um, but then again, I'm living in a world that lionized King and worship him. I couldn't imagine. Maybe I could ask my dad. You know, but I think he was. Well, he might have been like 11 or 12 or something like that when Martin Luther King was killed. Um, but you know, my mom was born in 1958. Maybe she would know, and maybe I'll ask my dad one day if he thinks Martin Luther King could have been president. I'll ask him tomorrow, actually, when I see him. AJ3 says, "What I mean is, what is the big difference between black conservatives back then to today?" Oh well, in slavery, they weren't really conservatives in a traditional sense. They were mostly abolitionists, which was kind of a left wing position, but they were constitutionalists. They wanted people to respect the rights of blacks as bound by the Constitution, which used to be a liberal position, is that the Constitution applies to everybody equally, and that there were no sacred cows. And then the communists came in and started creating sacred cows. But the difference being that Frederick Douglass was fighting against a system of enslavement, and Clarence Thomas is not. That's the biggest difference. You know, if you look at it from a passing of the torch or a passing of the baton, you have Frederick Douglass was dealing primarily with slavery and institutional oppression, and then he passed the torch to Booker T. Washington, which is all about individual advancement, um, private, and in some ways race-based uplift from creating black schools and black hospitals, black training programs. Um, Not so much slavery because Booker T. Washington was born a slave, but it was actually at the tail end of slavery. So he was not a slave nearly as long as Frederick Douglass was. And so his primary focus was on uplifting. You know, let's get these newly enslaved, newly freed people, these children who are the first generation of children that are born after slavery, let's get them educated. Let's get them jobs. Let's make them useful to their country. And then you pass the torch from that to, well, Marcus Garvey tried it. He wasn't even American, but he came right after Booker T. Washington died, and it became about, but some people say that Marcus Garvey was a communist too. But I don't know that much about that. I know he was anti-communist as well, but this was in the 1910s and 1920s. He probably did not have a fully functioning idea of what communism was. But you saw Frederick Douglass. He was a little bit more liberal, a firebrand, the street preacher type, but was still about private industry, racial uplift, starting your own newspaper, starting your own businesses. But it was race consciousness, mostly race conscious. And you start seeing like there was a diversion. The Marcus Garvey types, they went in a completely different way. Marcus Garvey would be like the forefront to Noble Drew Ali, and Noble Drew Ali would be the forefront to Elijah Muhammad in the Nation of Islam, Wallace D. Fard, and all those guys. Then the Nation of Gods and Earths, and that whole wacky wing of religious religious figures. Even though Marcus Garvey was a Christian. How he ended up becoming the intellectual leader. I don't even want to say leader, but I say intellectual mentor to all these Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim movements is very entertaining. But that's kind of like the lineage, is that each generation had their own focus. You know, the conservatives of the civil rights movement were mostly the people in the NAACP who were sort of the liberals of today. You know, they were fighting for equal rights, but they was fighting equal rights in the courts. The difference between Martin Luther King and the NAACP is Martin Luther King was, let's go do a sit-in and have a protest in the street and all this kind of stuff, while the NAACP was sitting back waiting for something to happen, and then they would try to go to court over it. You know, they started having some wins. You know, they had a bunch of losses, but they started having some wins in the court system because they wanted to set the standard that the law applied to black people too. You know, and then you had the revolutionaries, which of course Martin Luther King was sort of the leader of that, and then from him you sparked up Malcolm X, then the Black Panther Party, then the Black Liberation Army, the Syndicalese Liberation Army, which there might even been all that stuff around the same time. And then Martin Luther King, of course, from that wing you get Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, the Black Lives Matter group, all these protest groups that is sparked from the previous protest group. A lot of it is infiltrated with communists from the very beginning, because again, the communists were there with Martin Luther King. They just went to Jesse Jackson, then they went to Al Sharpton, then they went to the Black Lives Matter groups, and they're still there. They were with Obama in his early days. They have just basically latched on and dragged Black America to the left. But each generation has decided to fight their own little battles that they had to deal with. Like Black conservatives of the 70s or whatever are probably more hawkish on the Vietnam War than they would be today. You know, you might have even thought people that were for the draft, thought the draft was a good idea. But you basically have to look at it by the issues, and clearly by the institution that you're looking at. Like the Black church has gone incredibly far left. It's super far left. And that has led us to complete and total ruin as a group. Which I'm saying, like, fuck the group. You need to be an individual. WG Phil says Gothix is probably the PR community manager. Oh, okay. Well, I'm pretty sure she's good at that. So I don't know what else. That seems to be working out all right. I mean, every time I see something like that, it's negative, and I'm like, I don't see what the negativity is all about. I would imagine that they get along. Gothix is an alternative Black woman who's very Christian, and so is Eric July. He's an alternative Black guy. He's into rock music and a bunch of other shit, and he's a super Christian. I'm surprised they haven't linked up and done stuff more more recently, So I'm not that surprised that they get along. Why wouldn't they? If you saw Gothix a picture of her, especially when I first saw her channel, I was thinking to myself, like, man, for starters, she's a good looking woman. Secondly, you're like, she's like one of these black lipstick, alternative girls. And I was like, but she ended up being really smooth, down to earth, and cool and pretty funny. Did I see her documentary? I did not. Again, I don't really pay that close attention to that stuff. You saw Doug? Which Doug? There seems to be a bunch of Dougs. You said he tried to go after Eric after he defended Nick Ricciata. Well, Ricky, didn't he plead guilty to all these crimes or whatever? But what Doug are we talking about? Um, Doug Ernst? Well, because Doug Ernst is a comic book guy now. I don't think he even does YouTube anymore. At least I haven't seen him do YouTube in forever. I don't see what they would have a disagreement about. But um, both guys are religious, so maybe it's a religious argument that they're having. Oh, Doug Tenapel. Oh, okay. Yeah, I saw Doug Tenapel criticize Eric Young. Eric Young. I mean, Eric July. I did see that. Um, I heard they talked it out, but it seemingly comes out of nowhere that a bunch of people just start attacking him out of nowhere. Says, did you get to see the Rippaverse upcoming comics? Which one interests you the most this year? I already said I'm not buying any more of those. I bought the first two Isom books. I'm thinking I'm straight on those, so I haven't been paying attention to what he's going to release. And plus, every time I look, it's it seems look. I'm not going to say it's Eric's fault because I know it's not, but it's constantly with the shit with EVS, and there's just a lot of toxicity there. And I know that it's not coming from Eric July's side. You know, it's coming from EVS's side because he's always in the middle of something. But to me, I don't think that the Rippaverse books are, well, the two that I've read, I only read two, were good enough for me to invest more time and money in. So I wish him well. I wish him luck. And if something pops up that I think might actually be cool, I may get it, may consider it. But I'm not really interested in paying $40 for comic books anymore. You know, like I think I'm past the let's get this indie company up and running kind of gimmick. Like the only ones that if I had to, hey, you need to give money to some kind of comic book company so that you can get a book directly delivered to you, and the book is probably overpriced. It'll probably be Common America because I have bought like 8 of those things out of the comic book store. I love the Common America series. It's really good, actually. And but when it comes to your boy Zach, the Rippaverse guys, I haven't. You know, EVS. I'm not spending no money on that shit. You know, if the main selling point is hatred and dislike of somebody else, or you know some other kind of bullshit, I got no interest in it. And that's the one thing I will say is Eric July at least has created some level of interest in the characters that he's creating and the universe that he's building, and so that's good. And that's the way to do it. That's the appropriate way to do it. And it seems like a lot of people are jealous, and Doug Tenapel is one of those people that has been jealous, and EVS is super jealous. He's terrible, you know. So, uh, I'm glad I dipped out when I did, you know. But it's gotten really shitty around there. It doesn't really seem to be helping anybody either, if we're being honest. All right, y'all. Thank y'all for stopping by. I appreciate it. Be back next week. This Thursday is going to be the Q&A. Next week is the Royal Rumble. I don't know if there will be a pop culture video next week. It probably will be. And maybe it'll be Sunday, or maybe Sunday afternoon. But thank you guys for your time. Hope to talk to you guys later.